Hello and welcome to Moneylife News and Views. I'm Debashis Basu. There's a lot of talk all around about economic development. The government has talked about India becoming a developed country by 2047 or 2049. Doesn't matter which year. I've been discussing various aspects of economic development. About some time ago, I discussed the role of human capital in it, in how to create economic growth. What is the real ingredient in creating economic prosperity? What can we learn from countries which have already done that? Countries like Japan, Korea, China, Singapore, and so on. Well, economists have been thinking about this quite a lot. The standard answers tend to come in the form of models, policies, plans of action, and so on and so forth. Now, to conclude that any of these things would by themselves create prosperity is like believing eggs, sugar, and flour will turn into a cake if left overnight in a mixing bowl. This is how Yuen Yang, a Singaporean political scientist and the author of How China Escaped the Poverty Trap, how she puts it. So, what is the lesson? Prosperity has to be willed into existence. It has to be created, organized, and sustained. That in turn leads to the question, who will do the willing? Who will do the organizing? Obviously, leadership. Curiously, development economics has never placed leadership at the center of its explanation of prosperity. This is pretty odd because the quality of leadership determines whether a country takes the right economic and social decisions at the right time, whether it learns from its mistakes, whether it changes course when circumstances demand it, when something doesn't go right. Policies do not implement themselves. Institutions do not reform themselves. Economies do not spontaneously decide to become productive. Someone has to make these choices, overcome resistance, persist when the results are neither immediate nor convenient. A country, as in any other organization, that someone is its leadership. But leadership is not central to economic theories that describe how a country prospers. Let's look back what the theories are. Thinkers have long tried to explain why some nations become rich while others remain poor. David Hume, Adam Smith, David Ricardo regarded economic growth as central to political economy, but modern growth theory emerged only in the 1940s, as late as that, with what is called a Harrod-Domer model and later the Solow-Swan framework. Robert Solow, who got a Nobel Prize for this, established that long-term growth depends on capital accumulation, labor, and technological progress. From the 1980s, Paul Romer and Robert Lucas brought technology and knowledge creation into the model, which is why last time I talked about human capital, emphasizing innovation, research and development, and human capital and learning by doing as sources of sustained growth. This separately, institutional economists such as Douglas North and later Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson, they won the Nobel Prize 2 years ago, shifted attention to deeper determinants of growth. They said property laws, governance, rule of law, and political institutions are essential. Now, running alongside these theories was what is called the structuralist school, associated with Paul Rosenstein Rodin, who argued that markets alone could not overcome coordination failures, economies of scale, and structural rigidities in poor countries. It therefore advocated that the state should play a major role, what India did under Nehru. State should use industrial policy and public investment to accelerate industrialization. This is where actually economic theory was applied across the board in Africa, in Asia, and many other countries. But the results were disappointing. And there was huge debt crisis in the 1980s in precisely these countries which used state to create prosperity. Simultaneously, the collapse of the socialist economies then shifted the intellectual consensus towards the markets. Then the IMF and the World Bank came and said, well, state is a very bad investor. It cannot create prosperity. What you need is an invisible hand to guide, and that invisible hand should liberalize, privatize, deregulate, and maintain macroeconomic discipline. So this is what was called the Washington Consensus. Now, what is striking about this intellectual history is, as I said, nobody talked about leadership. leadership barely appears any of this. This is particularly surprising because a large proportion of poor countries have historically suffered not from a shortage of ideas, not from a shortage of theories. There are enough of foreign consultants and domestic theorists to say do this or do that, but they suffered, as India did, and India is still doing, is from a government dominated by kleptocrats, predatory political classes, protected elites. In these circumstances, it's difficult to see how another refinement to a growth model, how another change in policy can deliver prosperity. A country can have excellent policies on paper and still be incapable of implementing them. It can have abundant natural resources and remain poor. Look at Africa, look at Latin America. It can have foreign capital and squander it. It can have technically competent bureaucrats and political leaders determined to undermine them. Leadership, after all, is the decisive variable in almost every form of successful organization, whether social, political, or corporate. Why should it be different for a country? After all, nobody seriously believes that Jamshedji Tata played no central role in creating the Tata industrial empire, or that Tesla and SpaceX would necessarily have achieved the same success under a different leader other than Elon Musk. Nor would it make much sense to explain China's extraordinary economic transformation without considering Deng Xiaoping and the political system that subsequently evolved to select and empower a series of high quality leaders. It's difficult to defend that leadership matters enormously to companies but does not matter to countries. The more interesting question is whether this proposition can be demonstrated rather than merely illustrated. Is it just another theory? No. There is evidence that it can be demonstrated. Economists Benjamin Jones and Benjamin Olkin examined the economic consequences of the random exogenous deaths of national leaders in office. What did they do? Their approach was ingenious. If a leader dies unexpectedly, the event is largely unrelated to the immediate economic trajectory of the country. By comparing economic performance before and after such deaths, they could examine whether the identity of the executive actually mattered, and it did. Their research found that changes in national leadership can produce substantial changes in economic growth rates. The implication is uncomfortable for theories that treat leaders as little more than occupants of an institutional chair. The person at the top can completely change the trajectory of an economy. And when I say the person at the top, I mean a set of leaders at the top and an institutional system that can send high quality leaders continuously to the top. It's not just one person. It's not about a king. There is another curious asymmetry. There are hundreds, perhaps thousands of books on leadership lessons from outstanding companies. Business schools devote entire courses of the characteristics of successful chief executives. Corporate histories routinely ask why one leader transformed a company while another destroyed it. Yet, there are remarkably few systematic attempts to ask what the leadership of successful countries, Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan, or China, for example, can teach us about economic development. A 2010 World Bank paper, Leadership and Growth, offers some clues. It examines Singapore's remarkable economic performance over the 4 decades following independence and drew insights of senior minister Goh Chok Tong, who served as Singapore's Prime Minister from 1990 to 2004. Goh's framework identified three broad determinants of economic performance. Number one, resources. It could be natural endowment, inherited institutions, or accumulated capital. So resources was number one. Number two, growth paradigm. What kind of belief is behind your policies? Either you trying to create capital, or you're trying to distribute wealth. So wealth generation versus wealth distribution could be a growth paradigm. What do you believe in as a country? And number three, formulation and effective execution of the right policies. The distinction is important because empirical experience suggests that the third factor, which is effective implementation of the right policies, can compensate for the weaknesses of the first two, which is a country which has low and very little natural resources, or a country which does not have a very clear growth paradigm, can still overcome the problems if it has a very high quality of executive leadership. And don't forget, executive leadership has been the primary driver of development in South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and China. These countries are completely different from one another. Even if your country is endowed with no natural resources, like Singapore, and does not start from a preconceived growth paradigm. Smart leaders can learn by doing, making course corrections, and transform their countries. Go emphasizes that sustained growth is often the result of persistent fine tuning of policies. This review process, through honest self reflection against clearly defined benchmarks, provides the necessary accountability. What determines such policies implementation and policy review? Go identifies three factors: robust institution, leadership, and social consensus. Note that poor leadership cannot create the other two. A poor leadership cannot create social consensus and cannot create robust institutions. The same logic can be seen across the world. None of the prosperous countries began with institutions, incomes, or technological capabilities that they have today. Their leaders learned, experimented, adjusted, and crucially, changed direction when existing policies stopped working. Now, this brings us to the more difficult question: what makes a good leader? Go's answer is stark. Leaders should be visionary and diligent, but also selflessly devoted to national rather than party or personal interests. Now look around. Do you find anybody who can fit this bill? Credibility requires integrity. Leaders must be incorruptible or at least operate within a system that gives them a strong incentives to remain so, and they must be honest about what is and what is not working. None of this sounds particularly revolutionary, yet it becomes revolutionary when applied to economic development. Transforming a poor economy into a prosperous one requires a series of decisions that are rarely easy and almost never painless. A country must build better and better human capital. It must integrate with global markets rather than retreat from them. It must absorb foreign technology and eventually generate its own. It must continually raise productivity. It must invest in infrastructure while keeping its costs competitive. And it must reform institutions without destroying the stability that makes investment possible. None of these things happens automatically. The invisible hand, therefore, has a visible partner. The experience of the fastest growing economies suggests that development is a political and institutional process driven by people who make choices under uncertainty. Successful leaders distinguish themselves not by never making mistakes but recognizing them early enough to correct them. This may explain why countries with apparently similar resources, institutions, and access to markets can follow different trajectories. Now, this does not mean that charismatic leaders are what you need. One guy who comes and changes everything. Let's not confuse that with good governance. A country cannot build prosperity around personality, and that to one person. It is honest, wise, and visionary leadership committed to course correction that makes it happen. The invisible hand of the market may be indispensable, but history suggests that in countries that successfully transformed themselves, it was accompanied by another hand, a visible, fallible, and distinctly human hand. Empirical evidence says so. It's time for growth theories to catch up. And it is time for educated, intelligent people in developing countries like ours to ask ourselves, are our leaders serious, visionary, incorruptible, and selfless people devoted to national rather than party or personal interests? If the answer is no, you know what happens to this country's economic development. I hope you liked it. If you did, please do share and please do subscribe to this channel if you haven't.